People are importing these Japanese boats from the other side of the world. They're hiring brokers they've never met, navigating paperwork written in a language they don't speak, and waiting months for a vessel that hasn't turned a propeller in years. And when you understand what they're actually getting, every bit of that effort starts to make sense. This isn't a super yacht. It isn't a racing hull or a luxury cruiser with a price tag that requires a second mortgage. It doesn't have a famous name, a glossy magazine spread, or a spot in any American showroom. From the outside, it looks modest, purposeful, almost plain. Just a compact, well-built Japanese boat that was never intended to leave Japan, designed for people who actually use their boats rather than store them. That's exactly the problem. Japan never officially exported it. No dealership network, no factory warranty program, no customer service line with an American area code. The manufacturers built it for domestic waters, domestic standards, and domestic buyers, and then largely left the rest of the world out of the conversation entirely. For most boats, that would be the end of the story. But Americans started paying attention. Forum threads turned into Facebook groups. Facebook groups turned into waiting lists. People who had never navigated an import process before started learning what JCI certification means, and which brokers in Osaka actually return emails. The demand didn't come from marketing. It came from word of mouth between people who had seen one up close and couldn't stop thinking about it. Once you understand what this boat was built to do and how it was built to do it, the obsession stops being surprising. It becomes completely obvious. This is that explanation. To understand why this boat exists, you have to understand the water it was built for. Japan's coastline stretches over 29,000 kilometers, winding through narrow inlets, tidal rivers, and fishing communities where the sea isn't a weekend destination. It's a workplace. The boats serving those communities needed to reflect that reality, and the Japanese marine industry responded with something the rest of the world largely wasn't building. The vessel at the center of this story is a domestic market aluminum hull craft, produced by manufacturers like Yamaha and Tohatsu specifically for Japan's coastal and inland waterways. These weren't designed with export in mind. They were designed to pass the Japan Craft Inspection, the JCI, a certification standard that demands a level of structural integrity and safety engineering that goes well beyond what most international equivalents require. To earn JCI approval, a boat has to be built properly. There's no shortcut version, no market entry trim level, no cost-reduced variant for buyers who want something cheaper. You build it right or you don't build it. That standard shaped everything. The aluminum hull construction wasn't chosen for aesthetics. Aluminum resists. Corrosion at a level fiberglass simply cannot match over decades of saltwater exposure. It dents rather than cracks. It can be repaired without specialist equipment. It handles the repeated stress of daily use without quietly degrading beneath a painted surface where nobody thinks to look. Built for Japan's coasts, built for Japan's standards, built for Japan's conditions, these hulls were engineered around the assumption that the owner would depend on this boat, not just enjoy it. That's the foundation everything else rests on. Not a design decision made in a boardroom to hit a price point, but an engineering philosophy shaped by the water these boats were always going to face. What sits beneath the deck is where the argument really gets made. Most of these boats run Yamaha or Suzuki, outboard and inboard engines, the same units powering commercial fishing vessels across Southeast Asia, and rated for thousands of operational hours before requiring anything beyond routine servicing. These aren't performance engines chasing speed records. They're workhorses built around the idea that stopping is not an option when you're 3 miles offshore and the weather is changing. Fuel consumption tells part of the story. A comparable American-built recreational boat of similar length will burn through fuel at a rate that makes long days on the water expensive by default. These Japanese hulls, lighter by design and paired with engines tuned for efficiency over power, return numbers that make extended coastal cruising genuinely affordable. That difference compounds over years of ownership in ways that are hard to ignore once you've done the math. American boats in the same era were already getting complicated. More electronics, more systems, more components that needed specialists when something went wrong. This boat went the other way. The engine is accessible. The wiring is clean and logical. The mechanical layout rewards basic knowledge rather than demanding a dealership visit every time something needs attention. Any competent marine mechanic who knows Japanese outboard engines can open the cowling and understand immediately what they're looking at. The shallow draft is another thing entirely. These hulls were designed for Japan's tidal inlets and river mouths, places where the water gets thin fast and a deep-keeled boat runs aground before the captain realizes the mistake. That same shallow draft opens up stretches of American coastline, barrier island channels, and backcountry flats that deeper boats simply cannot reach. More water, more access, more freedom. It doesn't try to impress. It just works. Step aboard and the first thing you notice is that nothing feels wasted. Every surface has a purpose. Every dimension was decided by someone who had clearly spent real time on the water, not in a design studio trying to make a brochure photograph look appealing. The cabin is compact by American standards, but compact in the way a well-organized workshop is compact. Everything is within reach because everything was placed with intention. Japanese marine manufacturers building these domestic market hulls approached interior layout the way a ship's carpenter approaches a working vessel. Storage is built into the hull sides, tucked beneath seating, integrated into spaces that an American builder would have left empty or filled with something decorative. The galley setup is modest and completely functional. A stove, a sink, cold storage, positioned so that preparing a meal underway doesn't require navigating around unnecessary obstacles. The sleeping berths are narrow enough to feel secure in a swell and long enough to actually accommodate an adult. That balance is harder to achieve than it sounds. Compare this to American recreational boats of similar length from the same period. Wide open, visually impressive at a boat show, and oddly difficult to actually live aboard for more than a weekend. Counter space sacrificed for a larger helm console. Storage compartments positioned for appearance rather than access. Berths designed around the dimensions of a showroom rather than the reality of an overnight passage. Style had crept ahead of substance in ways the market had largely stopped questioning. This boat never made that trade. It was built for couples who wanted to move along a coastline for a week without stopping at a marina every night, for solo sailors who needed a vessel that worked with them rather than against them. It feels larger than its hull length suggests, not because of any illusion, but because nothing inside it was ever wasted. Bringing one of these boats to America is not a simple process, and nobody who has done it will tell you otherwise. The starting point is federal importation law, specifically the rules governing vessels over a certain age, which opens a legal pathway for boats that have reached the 25-year threshold. That window makes importation possible, but possible and straightforward are two different things entirely. The process typically begins with a broker based in Japan, someone who sources vessels from domestic listings, auctions, and private sellers that American buyers would never find independently. Shipping a boat across the Pacific runs several $1,000s, depending on the vessel size and method, either in a container or loaded onto a roll-on roll-off cargo ship. Then comes customs clearance, compliance documentation, and state-level registration requirements that vary enough between states to require research before the boat ever leaves the dock in Japan. The friction is real. The wait is real. Most buyers spend between 6 and 12 months from first contact with a broker to the moment the boat actually sits in American water. And then something consistent happens. Almost every owner, without much prompting, says the same thing. It was worth it. Not grudgingly, not with qualifications, but clearly and without hesitation. Part of what makes the ownership experience manageable long-term is what sits under the engine cover. The Yamaha and Suzuki mechanical components in these boats are globally serviced units. Any marina mechanic who regularly works on Japanese outboards already knows these engines. Parts move through normal supply channels. There is no specialist knowledge barrier, no expensive proprietary system that only one dealership in the region understands. The same engineering honesty that made these boats easy to own in Japan makes them easy to own in America. The community built around them is small, knowledgeable, and completely unsurprised that the word is spreading. Step back far enough and a pattern becomes visible. The American recreational boat market spent decades moving in one direction: bigger hulls, taller consoles, more horsepower, more screens, more systems competing for attention on a helm that increasingly resembles an aircraft cockpit. Boats that impress at a distance and depreciate quickly, that spend the majority of their lives wrapped in storage covers at a marina, waiting for a weekend that often doesn't come. The industry optimized for the sale, not the ownership. Japan was solving a different problem. The boats coming out of domestic manufacturers like Yamaha and Tohatsu weren't built for showrooms. They were built for people who needed to be on the water regularly, reliably, and without drama. The design philosophy wasn't about impressing a buyer on the day of purchase. It was about still being trustworthy 10 years later, 20 years later, on a gray morning when the conditions aren't ideal and turning back isn't the preference. That's what Americans are actually importing. Not just aluminum and engine hours and clever storage solutions. They're importing a set of values that the domestic market quietly moved away from. Restraint, purposeful engineering, the confidence that comes from owning something built to last rather than built to sell. In a market full of vessels that promise adventure and deliver maintenance schedules, this boat does something rare. It keeps its promise. It goes where it's pointed, runs what it's asked to run, and asks very little in return beyond basic attention and reasonable care. Step back far enough and a pattern becomes visible. The American recreational boat market spent decades moving in one direction: bigger hulls, taller consoles, more horsepower, more screens, more systems competing for attention on a helm that increasingly resembles an aircraft cockpit. Boats that impress at a distance and depreciate quickly, that spend the majority of their lives wrapped in storage covers at a marina, waiting for a weekend that often doesn't come. The industry optimized for the sale, not the ownership. Japan was solving a different problem. The boats coming out of domestic manufacturers like Yamaha and Tohatsu weren't built for showrooms. They were built for people who needed to be on the water regularly, reliably, and without drama. The design philosophy wasn't about impressing a buyer on the day of purchase. It was about still being trustworthy 10 years later, 20 years later, on a gray morning when the conditions aren't ideal and turning back isn't the preference. That's what Americans are actually importing. Not just aluminum and engine hours and clever storage solutions. They're importing a set of values that the domestic market quietly moved away from. Restraint, purposeful engineering, the confidence that comes from owning something built to last rather than built to sell. In a market full of vessels that promise adventure and deliver maintenance schedules, this boat does something rare. It keeps its promise. It goes where it's pointed, runs what it's asked to run, and asks very little in return beyond basic attention and reasonable care. When something is engineered properly, it never really goes out of style. And that truth doesn't need a marketing campaign behind it. It just needs time and enough people willing to look past what's being sold to them and pay attention to what actually works. These boats have had decades to prove themselves on Japanese coastal waters, in conditions that don't forgive poor construction or careless engineering. That proof exists in hull hours, in engine logs, in the simple fact that so many of them are still running exactly as intended. If this is the kind of content that interests you, subscribe, because there is a lot more where this came from. The world is full of vehicles and vessels built properly that most people simply haven't found yet.